Okay, crew. So we left off with kind of setting the stage for the French Revolution. We talked about how the estates were unfairly taxed, with the first and second estates, paying less than 2% of the taxes, but still each getting one vote. That the third estate was carrying the bulk of the burden of the taxes, and again, they only got one vote, even though they were like 98% of the population. So there was that meeting called for the Estates General to deal with this financial burden of France being involved in all kinds of wars and a couple years of drought causing bad crops. But when the Estates General meets to discuss increasing taxes, they locked out the Third Estate, and we're going to make them carry that burden. So the Third Estate kind of did something drastic in June of 1789. They declared themselves the, quote, National Assembly. This kind of gets the king nervous. They sign what's called the Tennis Court Oath, which is, going to change the power of the king and, make representation in the Estates General based on, more on population. They really kind of want to force the other two estates to join them in an effort to write this new constitution. But it's really kind of too little too late. By then, peasants throughout the land are growing increasingly restless with concerns that the king is not going to follow through on any of the major reforms they want. And you kind of have the start or the kickoff of the revolution. In the early days, that Marquis de Lafayette, the one who was helping the Americans in the War for Independence in the American colonies. This is the same guy who's, Lafayette in Hamilton, the musical. Same dude. So the National Assembly began meeting in Paris. The king threatens to arrest the leaders. And a crowd forms in Paris. They storm the Bastille, which had been, it's a castle, which had been a prison. It wasn't really a prison for the, murderers and rapists. It's a prison for political prisoners. So people who had spoken out against the king on one side, and on the other side is an armory, stashes of guns and cannons and gunpowder and stuff. So it is said that they stormed the Bastille to break out a bunch of prisoners on July 14th, 1789. Which is why they use that as their Independence Day. Ours is July 4th because the Declaration of Independence. Theirs, they mark the storming of the Bastille. So conveniently, while they release all these prisoners, they also happen to get their hands on a bunch of guns and ammunition. So peasants start rising up against nobles. And this is a scary time to be a noble. This is when kind of mob mentality does rule. And a lot of nobles are going to get scared, and several of them are going to flee the country and hide out in England and be known as emigres. And they're this kind of displaced, rich, kind of noble that lives in England, usually with, family because they're all related. Anyway, we don't need to go into that. You'll go into that if you take AP Euro. But so July 14th, 1789 becomes the French Independence Day. Here they abolish feudalism. They adopt the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. It's a document that recognizes things like natural rights and is based really on the ideas of the Enlightenment. The American Declaration of Independence is going to be a real kind of impetus. And you'll see when you look at the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen and you look at the Declaration of Independence from the United States, there is a lot of parallels that you see, which makes sense. Because they're both kind of based on those ideas of the Enlightenment, and particularly the writings of Rousseau. It gets copied, it gets distributed across Europe, continuing to further those ideas of freedom and equality, rule of law. So this new assembly, which is kind of this new government, the National Assembly, is also going to alter the monopoly that the Catholic Church had by declaring freedom of worship. The king and his family are taken to Paris, where they're imprisoned so that they can't interfere with the workings of this new government. And perhaps most importantly, the French Revolution is going to establish the nation state. not the king or the people as in the United States, but it's the nation state as the source of sovereignty or political authority. This makes France kind of the first, like, quote, modern government of its era. So now King Louis and the nobles refuse to accept this limited monarchy, dissatisfaction against radical groups such as the Jacobins are going to really kind of inspire this first French Republic. So what happens is you still technically have a king. The king's supposed to be limited. But remember how we talked about most of the royalty in Europe is all intermarried? Well, Louis's wife, Marie Antoinette, was also the sister of the Emperor of Austria. So the Austrians and the Prussians invade France to restore the monarchy, but the revolutionaries are able to hold them back. This leads to another new constitution, and where the convention becomes the new ruling body, and it quickly gets rid of the monarchy and proclaims France to be a republic. So now we don't need the king. And radicals, the Jacobins, are going to imprison the royal family, and in 1793 accuse the king and his wife of treason and have them beheaded. And apparently I did a major misspelling there. I'll fix that. And so after the beheading of the king, you're going to have what we call the Reign of Terror. People who are the Jacobins, who are the leaders, they call themselves the Committee of Public Safety, are going to follow them. But the Reign of Terror is when the Jacobins are in charge, led by Maximilien Robespierre, and the government, anybody who speaks out against the government is going to be seen as a threat to the Republic, the threat to freedom. So there's all these crazy stories out there of, like, anybody whose name was Louis would change their name because to have the name Louis was a threat against freedom. And I mean, this gets kind of crazy. There's a 10-year-old boy who gets beheaded by the guillotine because he chopped down a tree that had been planted in the name of liberty. So that's a crime against the state. I mean, people kind of go a little crazy. Thousands of opponents to the revolution, or anybody who has any whiff of being an opponent to the revolution, gets executed. It is said that the streets of Paris are run red with blood because of so many of these. This is in a period of like 2 years, 10,000 people have their heads cut off. It's crazy. Which, again, Robespierre and his committee, they're certainly not a committee of public safety. It's responsible for tens of thousands of people dying. It was successful at controlling the anarchy and protect France from an increasing number of countries in trying to invade and reestablish a monarchy. But the French really had enough of this kind of witch hunt after 2 years, and the Committee of Public Safety gets reorganized and run out of town. Robespierre also gets his head cut off. And you have the Directory established, which is like a 5-man oligarchy, really. And they're going to stop slavery, they're going to reform education, they're going to end the right of primogeniture, that idea that all the land gets left to the oldest son. The problem with the Directory is they're not really strong at domestic policy, but they are good at building up the military. So they're going to bring about the rise of this next guy, Napoleon. So Napoleon, young guy, is going to become a general by the age of 24, and lots of military success on behalf of the Directory. He comes back to France and uses his reputation and huge popularity to overthrow them. He's going to legitimize his overthrow by putting his overthrowing to a popular vote, and so he becomes popularly elected and declares himself first consul and then emperor. He is going to do some things that are kind of unusual for the time. He's going to initiate a lot of reforms in agriculture, changing some infrastructure, public education, and he's going to normalize relations with the church and bring about a degree of tolerance and stability. But most important is his Napoleonic Code. In 1804, these codes, these laws, are going to recognize the equality of all French citizens at this time, men, and really institutionalizing a lot of Enlightenment ideas that were a lot of the original inspiration for the Revolution. So things like spreading the burden of taxation and trial by jury and freedom of religion, a public school system. This is all great, except it doesn't include women. It doesn't include children. It's not perfect, but it is a huge step forward in recognizing basic rights and establishing the concept of the rule of law. That it doesn't matter if you're rich or if you're poor or whatever, the law applies to you. So, but his biggest impact is going to be external, not internal. In this kind of crazy effort to spread France's glory throughout Europe and the Americas, he not only keeps people from invading him, but he's going to start gaining and expanding and getting more territory for France, which helps end the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But his greed eventually is going to get the better of him. He attacks Russia, gets baited all the way going to Moscow, where the Russians use a classical tactic of slash and burn and just wait for winter. I mean, let's face it, nobody can handle Russia in the winter. The troops had to trudge back to France and were attacked the whole way back. He loses the majority of his army. They're decimated. So the emperor gets forced into exile. They met the emperors that or the leaders of the countries that get rid of him meet in Vienna to decide how to restore their order and, quote, their own power at the Congress of Vienna. The principles of the coalition against him were the leaders of Austria, Russia, and Great Britain. Napoleon found out there wasn't a whole lot of getting along. And so he's going to escape his exile and come back for 100 days. And this is going to become the famous Battle of Waterloo in 1813, where the Allies unite against him. And then he eventually gets sent to permanent exile on the island of St. Helena, where he eventually dies. At the Congress of Vienna, they decide what to do with France and its inflated territories by basically putting everything back the way it used to be. We are going to talk about the Congress of Vienna a little bit on Friday. It's a big deal. Because the Congress of Vienna, in an attempt to put things back the way they used to be and kind of erase, any experience of the French Revolution and Napoleon off, the kind of the global memory of Europe, these former leaders don't realize people have had a taste of choice, and they're not going to tolerate going back to the way things were. So we're going to stop here for today. That's about 10 minutes, which is kind of my